In the past, royalty earned their status through acts of heroism and bravery. They came to believe that there was something special about their blood. It was even rumored to be blue. To them, it was essential that their blood did not mix with that of mere commoners.
Well, the royals always saw themselves as a race apart. This is why royals married other royals, why they would never allow any marriage out of a royal family. It didn't matter if a princess was ugly or stupid or ill or anything. As long as she was a member of a royal family, this is really what was most important.
For most monarchs, passing on the royal blood to the next generation was vital. But for Queen Victoria, this obsession had tragic consequences. At Buckingham Palace, on the 7th of April 1853, Queen Victoria was in labour with her 8th child. At 1:15, she gave birth to what appeared to be a healthy little boy, her 4th son, Leopold. At first sight, there was nothing wrong with Leopold. But tragically, he was to have the most miserable and lonely childhood of any of Victoria's children. Victoria barely acknowledged him, and when she did, it was only to find fault with him. But what no one knew was that from birth, this little boy suffered from a disease that was to ravage the royal houses of Europe. Leopold grew up with his brothers and sisters at Osborne House on the Isle of Wight. But as he got older, it became clear that he was different. He was particularly clumsy and took days in bed to recover from what appeared to be only minor accidents. But when mysterious bruises kept appearing on him, the doctors became concerned.
He'd had a bruise, and it appears that he had a swollen lip, so he must have fallen on his face, that left him bedridden for about a week. But it was at that point they really started to realise that there was more to it than just a clumsy child.
Okay. If you could just raise the gown, please.
Whenever Leopold suffered a fall, his bruises became horribly swollen and tender. He seemed to be bleeding uncontrollably into his joints. The doctors did what they could to stem the flow of blood, with some rather crude and painful treatments.
If he fell over and bruised himself, in order to stop him from overbleeding, they would tie tight bandages around his legs or around the joints to prevent the bleeding and the swelling from becoming too great. Once when he was reading and writing, a pen nib got stuck in the roof of his mouth, and in order to stop the bleeding they had to take the rather drastic step of cauterizing the roof of his mouth, and the way that they did this was using a liquid that would burn, something like a hydrochloric acid, on the end of a paintbrush and painting it onto the roof of his mouth. It was such a painful treatment that it had to be done with Prince Albert and Queen Victoria well out of the way, because they really wouldn't have enjoyed the sound of him screaming.
That's just be a brave chap.
No one could explain to Leopold what was wrong. His doctors stressed that every bump or bruise might lead to a fatal bleed, so he was kept a lonely prisoner in his room at Osborne House. What no one at the time knew was that Leopold's problem was genetic. He had a rare inherited blood disorder, hemophilia. Hemophiliacs are missing a vital component in their blood that allows it to clot when the body is injured in a bump or a fall. Joints are particularly susceptible.
The problem with haemophilia is that people tend to bleed apparently spontaneously. This probably occurs because, although we don't realise it, when we're walking around, we're getting minor injuries and cuts in tiny little capillaries and blood vessels in the body, which in the normal circumstances, in normal people, would be repaired, the clotting would occur, and there wouldn't be any bleeding into the joint. But if this process doesn't work, these minor, apparently spontaneous internal bleeds obviously are not controlled, and this leads to internal bleeding.
Just at the time when Leopold's doctors were struggling to understand his disease, the world's first medical paper on haemophilia was published in Germany. The Queen's unfortunate son, Leopold, was one of the first people in England to be diagnosed with the disease. It was a terrible revelation.
To have been told that a son of yours had haemophilia in the latter part of the 19th century would have been very serious news, and indeed akin to giving somebody a death sentence, because in the absence of effective treatment at the time, very few children with haemophilia would have survived into adolescence.
Although Leopold spent most of his time hidden away at Osborne House, in public he was made to keep up appearances. Victoria was told of the haemophilia diagnosis, but there was no way a woman as powerful as Victoria could reveal that her bloodline might be tainted with a genetic disease. It could ruin her children's chances of marriage. Even though doctors at the time realized haemophilia was hereditary, it is unknown whether Queen Victoria herself ever really understood this. After all, haemophilia had never been seen before in her family.
It was never clear that Queen Victoria knew about the hereditary nature of haemophilia. She herself didn't have haemophilia, and she doesn't believe that anyone else in her family from the past had haemophilia, so how can this be an inherited disease?
Alexander Kelly and his brother Giles are haemophiliacs who have just the same symptoms as Leopold did. And like him, there was no history of the disease in their family.
Alexander had lots of bruises on his ribs, just literally fingerprints on either side of his ribs, where somebody had just sort of picked him up and cuddled him. And I thought that was really unusual and was a bit worried about what could be causing that. They did some blood tests, and after about 3 days they eventually diagnosed that in fact it was haemophilia. It was quite a sort of shock. You just expect your children always to be healthy and fine.
For Carolyn, like Queen Victoria, the haemophilia came as a complete surprise. It is now known that over a third of all cases of haemophilia arise spontaneously, rather than being passed on from a parent. And that's what appears to have happened to Queen Victoria. But there was something else that baffled 19th century doctors. Why is it that only men suffer from haemophilia? And women only pass it on? Modern science can explain why this is. Women like Queen Victoria can only carry haemophilia because they have 2 X chromosomes. The faulty gene for haemophilia is carried on one of them, and the other good chromosome compensates for this. But men have only 1 X and 1 Y chromosome. So when they inherit the faulty X chromosome from their mother, they have no good gene on the Y to compensate. Although Leopold was the only son to inherit the disease, any one of the 5 daughters had a 50-50 chance of carrying it. There was no way of knowing where the genetic curse of Queen Victoria would crop up next. It wasn't long before disaster struck. When Queen Victoria's grandson, Fritzi, aged just 2, tragically bled to death from a minor injury, it became clear haemophilia had spread in the royal bloodline. But Victoria still refused to believe there was a family connection.
Part of the role of Queen is to have princes and princesses and keep the royal family going throughout Europe. That's how they keep power going. And to know that your family has a blood disease like this is a time bomb. So I don't think Queen Victoria would have wanted to realise that it was inherited.
Unlike his nephew, Fritzi, Leopold didn't die in childhood. Unusually for the time, he survived into adulthood. He was desperate to marry, but rumors of his health meant he was turned down by several potential brides. Eventually, he found happiness with a German princess, Helen of Baaldeck, and had a daughter. But he couldn't escape his haemophilia.
Leopold did live to see his first child born, but he went on a short trip over to Cannes, where in the Villa Nevada he had another of his falls, and after a long period of which they believed to have been blood seeping into his brain, he died, and he didn't live to see his second child born.
Although many royal families realized Leopold's death was due to haemophilia, the gains to be made by marrying a descendant of Queen Victoria blinded them to the terrible risks of inheriting the disease.
Queen Victoria's children went on to populate the houses of Europe, with not seeming to know or care that haemophilia might have been an issue. And I think in reality what was more important was their royal blood, not the possibility of tainted haemophilia blood.
The trouble with haemophilia is that one never exactly knows when it's going to strike. Not every daughter is necessarily a carrier, and not every son necessarily suffers from it. So therefore they couldn't really stop marriages because of the risk of haemophilia. It was simply a risk they felt they were prepared to take, to close their eyes to.
By the end of the 19th century, the Russian Tsar, Nicholas II, was scouring Europe for a wife. Although he ruled over an enormous empire, it was falling apart at the seams. What Russia needed now was strong leadership and a stable monarchy. But Nicholas was a sentimental man, and despite objections from his parents, he set his heart on marrying Alexandra, the granddaughter of Queen Victoria. Unwittingly, he had fallen in love with a woman who would destroy the Russian dynasty.
It wasn't thought important that there was haemophilia or suspected haemophilia in her family, because Queen Victoria had suggested that there was no haemophilia in the British royal family, and it was very unclear whether Alex would be a carrier or not.
Despite his parents' misgivings, the marriage produced 4 beautiful daughters. But all hopes for the royal succession depended on Alexandra producing a son.
It was absolutely essential that Alexandra should have a son, because in Russia, daughters couldn't inherit the throne. So after she'd produced 3 and then a 4th daughter, they were absolutely desperate for a son. And eventually, when he was born, this was a cause of enormous rejoicing and great relief, of course.
But at just 6 weeks old, their worst fears were confirmed when the baby, Alexei, began to bleed from the navel. He was a haemophiliac. Queen Victoria's gene had been inherited by the only heir to the Russian throne. It was a disaster for the royal family. In public, Alexei was frequently carried by a sailor to hide the fact that his joints were so swollen he could rarely walk. But it was still vital that he was groomed for the throne, and so in periods of respite, he went on parade with his father. It was essential that the Russian people saw him as a future ruler.
It was thought that they had to keep it absolutely to themselves that Alexei was ill. Had it been known that the only son was potentially fatally ill, then the dynasty would have been weakened.
Alexandra realized that she was responsible for bringing haemophilia into the Russian royal family, as her brother, Fritzi, had died of the disease. But at the time, she had no way of knowing that the odds of passing the disease on were as high as 50-50.
Of course, she had this terrible sense of guilt because she was the carrier. She was responsible for introducing it. So she was desperate.
Alexandra had no one to share the blame. She maintained vigil at Alexei's bedside, tormented by his pain. The doctors could offer no help. A member of court wrote,
"Think of the torture of that mother. A mother who knew that she herself was the cause of those sufferings, that she had transmitted the terrible disease against which human science was powerless.
There was no one Alexandra could turn to when Alexei was ill. Her only refuge was religion.
She'd taken it on wholeheartedly and become deeply involved with and deeply emotionally attached to the Russian Orthodox Church. But she was also always on the lookout for holy men, mystics, who she thought could help her with her son, could bring her closer to God, could purge this terrible disease. The doctors didn't seem to be able to help her, so she looked for help elsewhere.
In 1905, she met a holy man who brought hope of curing her son. The meeting was to change her life and that of the Russian royal family. The man's name was Rasputin.
Rasputin seemed to have a strange power to calm the child and also calm his mother. It's known that Rasputin had some sort of hypnotic abilities or powers. There were several occasions when Rasputin's appearance seemed to halt the bleeding and cure Alexei. Or at least that's how it was read, and certainly that's how Alexandra read it, and that's why she would have no truck with anybody who spoke badly of Rasputin.
Rasputin gained enormous influence in the family, as they believed he had mysterious powers to cure Alexei's suffering. These powers were put to the test when the royal family were on holiday in Poland in 1913. The journey there was a nightmare. The rough road caused an old injury of Alexei's to start to bleed. His whole trip was agony. But worse was yet to come. For 10 days, the bleeding continued, with no sign of stopping. There was nothing the doctors could do. It looked like Alexei would die. They even had public death notices prepared. Finally, they telegrammed Rasputin, who had stayed behind in Siberia, to ask him what they should do.
He sent one back, which said, "Do not grieve, the little one will not die. Only don't let the doctors bother him too much." And this had an immediate calming effect upon Alexandra, who was desperate by this stage. And remarkably enough, in a day or two, Alexei began to get better, having been at death's door.
The recovery was pure coincidence, but the royal family fell under Rasputin's spell. He gained extraordinary power over them, and when Nicholas joined the troops at the front, Alexandra left Rasputin in charge. It was a mistake that would destroy the family.
During the First World War, Rasputin had only to say, we've got to sack the Minister of the Interior, we've got to sack this one or that one, for Alexandra to tell Nicholas, you've got to sack him, and this is what they would do. In the end, the whole cabinet was simply appointees of Rasputin. Whatever he said simply carried the weight. Now, the aristocracy, especially the members of the royal family, they were very worried about this kind of very malign influence which he had over the Empress and over the Emperor.
Rasputin was murdered in 1916 by members of the aristocracy, but it was too late to save the monarchy. Revolution swept through Russia, and on the 17th of July 1918, Alexei and his family were herded into a small room on the pretense of having their photo taken. They were executed by firing squad. Queen Victoria's Hemophilia gene had played a terrible part in bringing to an end the 300-year-old Romanov dynasty.
It might not be too much to say that the final assassination came about because of the hemophilia. The fact that the Tsarevich had it, that Rasputin gained this undue influence over the Empress and over the Emperor, and that the royal family then lost a great deal of their popularity. And I think the revolution would have come anyway, with or without the hemophilia. But nevertheless, it was a contributing factor, and in the end, the imperial family simply had to pay the price.
It wasn't just in Russia that the monarchy was under threat of revolution. In Spain, one of the grandest royal families, the Bourbons, were only hanging on to power by a thread. And here too, the tainted blood of Queen Victoria would spread disaster. Aged just 19, King Alfonso XIII fell for the blonde good looks of Ina, a granddaughter of Queen Victoria, ignoring the warnings that she too might be a carrier of hemophilia.
Alfonso XIII knew all about the hemophilia. By then it was pretty well known throughout the courts of Europe. But he was a very daring, very dashing young man, simply prepared to take the chance. And she looked to him so beautiful, he couldn't believe that she could be a carrier, which is nonsense, of course. You don't have to look like anything to be a carrier. But he was ready to take the chance, and he thought it was a risk worth taking.
When their first son, nicknamed Alfonsito, was born, it appeared the royal line was secured. But at his circumcision, the terrible bleeding confirmed the worst. The heir to the throne had hemophilia. The Spanish people believed the boy's poor health was a punishment for centuries of greed and overindulgence in the monarchy. The king could not forgive his wife.
I cannot resign myself to the fact that my heir contracted an infirmity which was carried by my wife's family and not mine. I know I'm unjust, but I cannot think of it any other way.
In Spain especially, where there were so many political assassinations, it was very important that the heir was strong and healthy. I mean, there was a rumor spread by the peasants, believed by the peasants, that a young Spanish soldier had to be killed every day so his fresh blood could be pumped into the heir to keep the heir alive. Now, a lot of people believed this.
As Alfonsito came of age, he only made brief public appearances, confirming the rumors that he was unfit to rule. It was a godsend for the growing Republican movement.
Well, the fact that there was hemophilia in the family weakened their position a great deal. As the Republican movement grew in Spain, so did the Republicans realize that they really had a stick to beat the royal family with, because there was a strong chance that the dynasty couldn't go on.
Hemophilia was the final straw for the Spanish royal family. In a ballot in 1931, the monarchy were evicted from the throne, and Spain became a republic.